We have seen in the previous part how the usual linguistic way to assign sense, either on the basis of denotation, manifestation, or signification, leads to a loop called the circle of the proposition, such that sense cannot be determined in this way. Deleuze concluded from this impasse that sense is endowed with an inefficacious, impassive, and sterile splendor, and that to unfold the mystery of sense we must open the circle of the proposition and break the loop. This operation is the philosophical moment of Deleuze's reflection in logic of sense, so let us give it a closer look. Deleuze explains, sense is strictly the same for propositions which are opposed from the point of view of quality, quantity, relation, or modality. For all of these points of view affect denotation and the diverse aspects of its actualization or fulfillment in a state of affairs. But they do not affect either sense or expression. Concretely, this means the following. Two propositions like God is and God is not seem to be in contradiction with each other. They are qualitatively opposed, which is signaled by the negation. And yet, we are told they must have the same sense. Similarly, from the point of view of quantity, propositions like all swans are black, or no swan is black, or some swans are black, all have the same sense. Again, from the point of view of relation, both propositions I am older than you and you are older than me must also have the same sense. Finally, modality. The modality of a statement determines if the statement is about something possible or impossible, real or unreal, necessary or contingent. So, statements like friendship is possible, or friendship is real, or friendship is necessary all have the same sense. Why is sense indifferent to these aspects, and what does all of this reveal about sense? Sense is indifferent to these aspects because, as we have seen last time, all statements, including impossible statements, do appear to have a minimal amount of sense, enough at least to let us understand that they're impossible. What it shows is that sense is impervious to negation, quantity, quality, etc., but its characteristic feature or action is to separate propositions from things. Indeed, Deleuze says, things and propositions are less in a situation of radical duality and more on the two sides of a frontier represented by sense. This is to say that sense articulates the difference between body and language, matter and mind. Articulating their difference, Deleuze explains, means that sense is a surface effect, so it's a type of event rather than a form like negation or quantity or quality or etc. In other words, sense is not found in formal logic. It's more like a wave on the surface of a pond or a mist. It does something. Deleuze says, comparing the event to a mist rising over the prairie, we could say that this mist rises precisely at the frontier, at the juncture of things and propositions. As a result, the duality is reflected from both sides and in each of the two terms. Let us try to represent visually what Deleuze means here. We have a surface on which sense is an effect. As an effect, it separates propositions and things. But in turn, the division is reflected horizontally, so to speak, on both sides of the division itself. Deleuze says this. On the side of the thing, there are physical qualities and real relations which constitute the state of affairs. There are also ideational logical attributes which indicate incorporeal events. And on the side of the proposition, there are names and adjectives which denote the state of affairs. And also there are verbs which express events or logical attributes. On one hand, there are singular proper names, substantives, and general adjectives which indicate limits, pauses, rests, and presences. On the other, there are verbs carrying off with them becoming and its train of reversible events, and infinitely dividing their present into past and future. By the way, the fact that the separation is reflected again on both sides of the original division means that we are not dealing here with a classical form of philosophical dualism in which there would be only one fundamental separation, as for example in Descartes' ontological dualism between matter and mind. On the contrary, the repetition is repeated, which means that it is somehow dynamic. Let us examine what this separation is more closely. Deleuze says, "It is like the two sides of a mirror. Only what is on one side has no resemblance to what is on the other. To pass to the other side of the mirror is to pass from the relation of denotation to the relation of expression, without pausing at the intermediaries, namely at manifestation and signification. It is to reach a region where language no longer has any relation to that which it denotes, but only to that which it expresses, that is, to sense. This is the final displacement of the duality. It has now moved inside the proposition. So this separation is dynamic, we're told. It's like a mirror. What does this mean in practice? Where can we see this in our everyday use of language? Well, this separation is found in portmanteau words such as snark. The strange word snark is the frontier which is stretched as it is drawn by both series. So now we can see why Deleuze is so interested in Carroll's writings. They reveal, with these strange words, a fundamental aspect of sense, its tendency to divide things on the surface. But of course, this is not the final step of Deleuze's inquiry. The division itself reveals a profound mechanism at play within sense-making, which is that once a separation is effectuated on a surface, something is produced which Deleuze calls series, the series of objects or the series of propositions, or the series of nouns and adjectives, and the series of verbs and becomings. This is what is called the serial form, and as Deleuze emphasizes, the serial form is necessarily realized in the simultaneity of at least two series. This is a very important point. Whenever series are produced, there is an infinite regression that takes place, by which the sense of a name must be designated by another name, which then gives way to a new sense, etc. Deleuze says, every name which denotes an object may itself become the object of a new name, which denotes its sense. N1 refers to N2, which denotes the sense of N1. N2 refers to N3, etc. For each one of its names, language must contain a name for the sense of this name. Perhaps you can feel what's happening here on the conceptual level. The fact that a word always leads to the production of other words to designate its sense reveals a fundamental rhythm inside of language, the pauses and rests produced by adjectives and names as opposed to the speeds of verbs and becomings. This rhythm, of course, happens on the line of time. So what Deleuze is doing here is to introduce time as a factor and a variable in the production of sense. This temporality, this rhythm, is due to the dynamic dualism implied in the production of series. So now we understand why Deleuze was using the concept of surface. That is because the surface, by its very nature, is necessarily dual. There cannot be one side of a surface, like on a sheet of paper, without there being another side to the surface. It's the relation and difference between these two that produces the pauses and rests of language. The series themselves, as we have seen, separate things and propositions, denotations and expressions. But there is a great diversity between series. They can be series of things, propositions, expressions, adjectives, names and verbs, etc., etc. So in other words, it doesn't really matter how series are determined. What matters is that the series are never equal. They're never the same. This is why Deleuze names these two types of series, the signifier and the signified, after a very famous concept of modern linguistics. He says, the law governing two simultaneous series is that they are never equal. One represents the signifier, the other the signified. But thanks to our terminology, these two terms acquire a particular meaning. We call signifier any sign which presents in itself an aspect of sense. We call signified, on the contrary, that which serves as a correlative to this aspect of sense, that is, that which is defined in a duality relative to this aspect. Furthermore, the signifier is primarily the event, as the ideal logical attribute of a state of affairs, and the signified is the state of affairs together with its qualities and real relations. So this is what series are. But how do they relate to each other, since they are heterogeneous? The answer is that series are put in relation by a paradoxical instant. Deleuze says, what are the characteristics of this paradoxical entity? It circulates without end in both series, and for this reason assures their communication. It is a two-sided entity, equally present in the signifying and the signified series. It is the mirror. Thus, it is at once word and thing, name and object, sense and denotatum, expression and designation, etc. It guarantees, therefore, the convergence of the two series which it traverses, but precisely on the condition that it makes them endlessly diverge. It has the property of being always displaced in relation to itself. So you could say that this paradoxical instance is self-different, or as Deleuze says, it also fails to observe its own identity, resemblance, equilibrium, and origin, which is why it puts the series in relation through divergence. The relation effectuated by this paradoxical entity works only if the series are made to diverge. To be concrete, let us remember the word snark. What the snark is a paradoxical entity, and what it does is to put in relation two series, one of which is material, the other which is linguistic. Both, of course, very mysterious. Nobody knows what the snark is. Deleuze explains, we have seen that the best example of this paradoxical entity was the word snark. It circulates throughout the two series of alimentary and semiological orality, or throughout the two dimensions of the proposition, the denotative and the expressive. The word snark is indeterminate. It is similar to words like aliquid, it, that, thing, gadget, or whatchamacallit. So when you forget what the word for a thing is, and you say it's the whatchamacallit, you're pointing at something that is made to point at something. You're one step beyond normal designation, and therefore you are relating otherwise divergent series whose difference is signaled in this very relation. The series, it should be noted, are not abstract, they are concrete. And so what the abstract object puts in relation is specific particular elements or points of the series. Deleuze calls them singularities. So let us see what they are. Deleuze says this. We said that a set of singularities corresponds to each one of the series of a structure. Conversely, each singularity is the source of a series extending in a determined direction right up to the vicinity of another singularity. Perhaps you can see how these singularities, as they proliferate, create a great network in which every node or singularity is linked to every other node. This great network forms something like a giant underground web, like a rhizome, and each node in this network is an event which communicates with every other event so as to form one giant event with a capital E, which is like the network itself. What can we say about this network? We have seen how, in the most fundamental sense, the series as they communicate make explicit a certain form of time, a rhythm, which is the real basis of history. Deleuze says, if the singularities are veritable events, they communicate in one and the same event, which endlessly redistributes them, while their transformations form a history, which includes the history of language or the history of what you said today. So we can see now that singularities are essentially events, and we can appreciate how this concept contrasts with older concepts such as essence or accident. The event is not something that either precedes reality or can be empirically observed. An event, rather, is the thing that has the smallest possible quantity of being, which Deleuze previously called the impossible. As such, the event, mysterious as it is, encapsulates something that is both infinitely small in duration and yet eternal. It's a paradox. And it is what Deleuze calls the Aion, from a Greek word which means eternity, and from which we get our own word, Aion. Events are ideational singularities which communicate in one and the same event. They have therefore an eternal truth, and their time is never the present which realizes them and makes them exist. Rather, it is the unlimited aion, the infinitive, in which they subsist and insist. He goes on, the event by itself is problematic and problematizing. A problem is determined only by the singular points which express its conditions. We do not say that the problem is thereby resolved. On the contrary, it is determined as a problem. So, sets of singularities form a problem. The set of sounds which compose the word snark form a very concrete problem. It's a focal point. This focal point or problem is fundamentally different from the form of time that we're used to, which is the present. Because Aion, or the problem, the paradox, is not really about being here and now, it's more about analyzing memories, sounds, images, language itself, etc. That is to say, it's about cutting the present into past and future. This is the basis of the problem of time as posed by Deleuze in Logic of Sense, Chronos and Aion. We have seen that past, present and future were not at all three parts of a single temporality, but that they rather formed two readings of time, one of which is complete and excludes the other. On one hand, the always limited present, which measures the action of bodies as causes and the state of their mixtures in depth, that is Chronos. On the other, the essentially unlimited past and future which gather incorporeal events at the surface as effects, that is Aion. He goes on, in the one case, that of Chronos, the present is everything. The past and future indicate only the relative difference between two presents. One of these has a smaller extension, while the other has a contraction bearing upon a greater extension. In the other case, that of Aion, the present is nothing. It is a pure mathematical instant, a being of reason which expresses the past and the future into which it is divided. Briefly, there are two tunes, one of which is composed only of interlocking presents, the other is constantly decomposed into elongated pasts and futures. As Deleuze says elsewhere, Chronos is always definite, active or passive, cyclical. It measures the movement of bodies and depends on matter, which limits it and fulfills it. Aion, on the contrary, is infinitive and internally neutral, a pure straight line at the surface, incorporeal, unlimited, an empty form of time, independent of all matter. Aion was the line traced between things and propositions. But while they are distinct, Aion and Chronos appear to be mutually implicative. Deleuze says each event is adequate to the entire Aion. Each event communicates with all others, and they all form one and the same event, an event of the Aion, where they have an eternal truth. Concretely, this means Aion, the reasonable thing, infinitely and eternally cuts Chronos, the lived present, into pieces, but also, and by the same token, comprises it in its entirety. Each event, Deleuze continues, is the smallest time, smaller than the minimum of continuous thinkable time, because it is divided into proximate past and imminent future. But it is also the longest time, longer than the maximum of continuous thinkable time, because it is endlessly subdivided by the Aion, which renders it equal to its own unlimited line. Let us understand that each event in the Aion is smaller than the smallest subdivision of Chronos, but it is also greater than the greatest divisor of Chronos, namely the entire cycle. In practice, this means that a word is always presented in its entirety as a problem. And as a problem, not as a sound, it cuts the present in two parts, the before and the after of its occurrence, creating an imbalance or a difference within the continuous present. So ultimately, we are to understand that language cuts the present in an infinite number of parts, which is why we can both analyze and select specific words and make sense of them within the whole of a sentence and even within the whole of our lives. So while Chronos appears to be on the side of bodies, Aion is on the side of the mind. Now, if an event can cut the present in two, in the sense that a certain meaning can affect my body in the same sense that it can affect my mind, the question becomes, what is the causal relation between body and mind? Is it the case that physical bodies, like sounds, cause the mind to understand or form units of sense? This is indeed the last crucial step in our inquiry. Deleuze says, only bodies penetrate each other, only Chronos is filled up with states of affairs and the movement of the objects that it measures. But being an empty and unfolded form of time, the Aion subdivides ad infinitum that which haunts it without ever inhabiting it, the event for all events. This is why the unity of events or effects among themselves is very different from the unity of corporeal causes among themselves. Here begins Deleuze's theory of causality in logic of sense. On the side of Chronos, bodies actively produce certain affects, bodily sounds for example, while on the side of Aion or sense, these bodily sounds are cut, sorted out, and selected, meaning that while bodies of sounds are the cause in a certain way of the sense that we get from language, it is also true that the words of language must be distinguished from other sounds and other bodies, including other words. This is to say that the cause of sense appears to be both physical in the sounds that we hear, as well as incorporeal in the manner in which Aion cuts these sounds and separates them from each other. Deleuze says the two series are therefore articulated by their difference, and sense traverses the entire surface, although it remains on its own line. Undoubtedly, this immaterial sense is the result of corporeal things, of their mixtures, and of their actions and passions, but the result has a very different nature than the corporeal cause. It is for this reason that sense, as an effect, being always at the surface, refers to a quasi-cause, which is itself incorporeal. In other words, sense has two causes, one physical and the other incorporeal. And that's a huge problem from a philosophical perspective, because in this situation we cannot know which one is the real cause of sense. So what is this strange and incorporeal quasi-cause that Deleuze mentions? It is the empty box that we have examined before. Deleuze says, we have tried to ground this second causality in a way which would conform to the incorporeal character of the surface and the event. It seemed to us that the event, that is, sense, referred to a paradoxical element intervening as nonsense or as an aleatory point, and operating as a quasi-cause assuring the full autonomy of the effect. This means that sense is autonomous with regards to its bodily cause. Whatever effect a physical sound or word has on me, this effect is not in and of itself the meaning of the word, or its sense. Sense is something more, something of another nature. It's not purely physical, nor purely incorporeal. The autonomy of the effect, Deleuze says, is thus defined initially by its difference in nature from the cause. In the second place, it is defined by its relation to the quasi-cause. These two aspects, however, give sense very different and even apparently opposed characteristics, for insofar as it affirms its difference in nature from corporeal causes, states of affairs, qualities, and physical mixtures, sense as an effect or event is characterized by a striking impassibility, the one that we have seen in the beginning. What we are seeing emerge now is a new paradox. Sense is said to be both passive and yet productive, or to say it in Deleuze's terms, on the contrary, as soon as sense is grasped in its relation to the quasi-cause which produces and distributes it at the surface, it inherits, participates in, and even envelops and possesses the force of its ideational cause. We have seen that this cause is nothing outside of its effect, that it haunts its effect, and that it maintains with the effect an immanent relation which turns the product, the moment that is produced, into something productive. He goes on, how are we to reconcile these two contradictory aspects? On one hand, we have impassibility in relation to states of affairs and neutrality in relation to propositions. On the other hand, we have the power of genesis in relation to propositions and in relation to states of affairs themselves. How are we to reconcile the logical principle according to which a false proposition has a sense, so that sense as a condition of truth remains indifferent to both the true and the false, and to the no less certain transcendental principle according to which a proposition always has the truth, the part and the kind of truth which it merits and which belongs to it according to its sense? This might be the most fundamental problem discussed by Deleuze in Logic of Sense. This is the problem of the so-called immaculate conception of sense. At the heart of the logic of sense, Deleuze says, one always returns to this problem, this immaculate conception being the passage from sterility to genesis. We have seen before that each event is part of one event with a capital E. This great event is univocity, the univocity of being, which is going to solve this paradox. Deleuze says, the univocity of being does not mean that there is one and the same being. On the contrary, beings are multiple and different. They are always produced by a disjunctive synthesis, and they themselves are disjointed and divergent, membra disjuncta. The univocity of being signifies that being is voice, that it is said, and that it is said in one and the same sense of everything about which it is said. That of which it is said is not at all the same, but being is the same for everything about which it is said. Let us appreciate the contrast between this definition of being and the one that we have inherited from ancient times. For Plato, most notably, being is given first and produces, in and through the accidents of creation, the individual things that we observe in the real world, and which are but reflections or shadows on the wall of the cavern. The unity of the world of essences causes, for Plato, the multiplicity of beings that we can observe in our fallen world. Now, in Deleuze's framework, we have a great inversion, a great overturn of this principle. Eternity or eternal things are arrived at in and through language, but not after the process that we have seen. From the absolute multiplicity of singular events, series are produced and then put in relation by the paradoxical object. It is in this sense that of which being is said is not at all the same, but being is the same for everything about which it is said. So with the concept of univocity, we can construct a concept of being which unifies under one great voice the complexity and extreme multiplicity of things, or singularities, or events. Or as Deleuze says, if being cannot be said without also occurring, if being is the unique event in which all events communicate with one another, univocity refers both to what occurs and to what is said. Further, univocity means that it is the same thing which occurs and is said, the attributable to all bodies or states of affairs, and the expressible of every proposition. Univocity means the identity of the noematic attribute and that which is expressed linguistically, event and sense. It does not allow being to subsist in the vague state that it used to have in the perspectives of the analogy, which is essentially the perspective of Plato. Univocity raises and extracts being in order to distinguish it better from that in which it occurs and from that of which it is said. This univocal being will fulfill the properly philosophical task that was set out by Deleuze at the very beginning of Logic of Sense, and which we saw last time, namely to find this extra being, that is, the minimum of being common to the real, the possible, and the impossible. It is in this way that sense can be both P and not P, passive and productive. Passive in the sense that it designates being, and yet active in the sense that it makes it happen in language. The principle of contradiction is therefore respected by introducing temporality or change within the concept of sense itself, and in practice it does so by postulating an entity, the verb, which can effectuate this change and give to philosophy the means to open the circle of the proposition. Let us mention this final quote. The verb is the univocity of language, in the form of an undetermined infinitive, without person, without present, without any diversity of voice. It is poetry itself. As it expresses in language all events in one, the infinitive verb expresses the event of language, language being a unique event which merges now with that which renders it possible, namely the change or becoming implied in the verb. The next and final step in Deleuze's inquiry will have to address the problem of how language and in particular the subject are formed, and he will do this from a very special perspective, that of psychoanalysis, which constitutes the last part of Logic of Sense. We will examine this in the next video. Thank you for watching.